They flew me in just as the sky began to bleed orange across the horizon, that surreal hour when the desert doesn't look like Earth anymore. From the window of the chopper, it felt like we were gliding over a dried-out ocean, each dune a frozen wave under the dying sun. There were no roads, no power lines, no towns, just endless miles of wind-carved silence and heat. The pilot didn't talk much, just nodded toward the headphones, then tapped his watch and pointed down. I looked and saw a small square of metal and concrete in the middle of the sands, the Outpost. It looked like it had been dropped from the sky and forgotten. A squat building with antennas, solar panels half buried in dust, and one lonely landing pad. No welcome committee, no military fanfare, just one old man in a sun-bleached uniform waiting beside a rolling cart. His skin looked like it had been burned and tanned 100 times over, his eyes hidden behind wraparound sunglasses. He handed me a single key card with a faded number etched on it, 09, and a laminated sheet of paper with greasy fingerprints on the corners. That was it. I reached out to shake his hand, but he just turned and walked away toward a rusted truck that didn't look like it should still run. As he drove off, the wind picked up and hissed across the ground like something whispering beneath the sand. I stood there for a long moment, not sure what to do. Eventually, I looked down at the laminated sheet. 8 rules, printed in bold. The kind of thing you'd see on the break room wall of a fast food joint, except these didn't make any sense. Keep all doors locked after 1900, no exceptions. Never walk barefoot after dark. Do not leave food or water exposed overnight. Never sweep sand into the drains. Do not respond to voices calling from outside. If you see a man in a trench coat, do not engage. Never dig into the sand beyond the perimeter. If it watches, do not move. At first, I thought it was a joke, some weird hazing ritual for new hires, but the way the rules were worded, too precise, too serious, it made something in my stomach knot up. No contact name, no emergency number, just those 8 lines and a faint smell of oil on the paper. The outpost door opened with a hydraulic hiss when I swiped the card. Inside, the place was cooler but claustrophobic. Metal walls, fluorescent lights, and the smell of dust mixed with something chemical.
There was a kitchen, a cot, 2 desks with old monitors, and shelves stacked with binders that hadn't been touched in years. The lights flickered once, then steadied. I dropped my duffel on the floor and sat down at the main terminal. No internet, just a local feed. Cameras watching the perimeter, a map of the surrounding dunes, and a blinking message that said, "Shift, active, duration, 7 days." I thought about texting someone, my sister, my ex, anyone, but I already knew what they'd say. I was the one who volunteered. 6 months of unemployment, overdue rent, and no fallback plan makes a guy say yes to a lot of things. The recruiter said it was quiet work, high pay. Isolated, sure, but with bonuses. Nothing dangerous, just environmental monitoring and camera checks. They never mentioned the rules. That night, I explored the perimeter. The wind had died down, and the sky above was enormous, full of cold stars. No moon, just the hiss of my boots pressing into the sand. It shifted underfoot like something half asleep, heavy, soft, in a way that didn't feel right. The dunes weren't static. They pulsed, subtle and slow, like breath held in a giant chest. I turned off my flashlight, just for a moment. That's when I heard it. A soft clicking sound, like fingernails tapping glass. It came from below, then stopped. I turned the light back on and saw nothing but the smooth, windless dune behind me. My own footprints already half-filled, as if the ground had swallowed them. Back inside, I checked every lock. The doors sealed automatically at 1900, just like the rules said. I stared at the sheet again, this time reading slower. The last one gave me chills. Not who, it. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the cameras, watching empty black sand ripple like water. No movement, no sound, just wind and silence. But the strangest thing is what I felt right before I fell asleep. Not fear, not yet. just the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone out here, that the sand itself was waiting, watching, breathing, and somehow it already knew I had broken rule number 7. I'd walked past the perimeter. The first patrol was supposed to be routine. Walk the perimeter, check for structural damage, log any environmental abnormalities, then return before the temperature dropped. Simple, predictable, the kind of work anyone could do as long as they had boots, a flashlight, and the patience to walk in a straight line for an hour. But the moment I stepped off the concrete pad and onto the open dunes, I felt it. A wrongness in the ground, a softness deeper than normal sand, as if something under the surface shifted when I stepped on it. Not like quicksand, not like loose dunes, more like a creature rising and falling in shallow breaths. I paused, testing the ground with my heel. The sand lifted slightly, then settled. No wind, no seismic activity, just that gentle, unnatural motion. At first, I told myself it was heat haze playing tricks on me. The desert has a way of distorting everything. Distance, sound, even stability. But heat haze does not push back against your boots. Heat haze does not ripple in waves that travel outward from where you stand. I crouched and pressed my gloved hand into the sand. It moved again, a soft upward swell followed by a slow collapse, like inhalation and exhalation. The sensation made my skin crawl. I jerked my hand back, brushing grains from my palm even though they clung like fine dust. I pulled my radio from my belt. "Base, this is Site 9. I am observing unusual ground movement." Static answered me. A long, steady hiss. Nothing. The radio was supposed to reach the nearest hub, even with interference. I checked the antenna. Connected. Light on. Everything should have worked. I switched channels. Same static. Same silent refusal to acknowledge that I was out here alone. I lowered the radio and looked back toward the outpost. It seemed farther away than it should have been, distorted by distance, or by heat, or by something else. I forced myself to keep walking, circling the perimeter slowly, my boots sinking deeper with every step. The sand shifted constantly, not drifting, not blowing, moving with purpose, as if the desert was adjusting its posture beneath me. I saw small ridges form where there should have been smooth surface. The dunes lifted in shallow arcs, then flattened again. A rhythm, a pulse, a presence. I kept checking the sky for signs of wind, but the air was still and empty, no movement, not even the whisper of a breeze. The silence was heavy enough to feel on my skin. Sound died here. Breath settled wrong in my chest. Every instinct told me I should go back, but every training manual said to complete the patrol. Halfway around the outpost, I stopped again. The sand ahead of me was rising slowly in a long, low curve, a swell in the desert, 10 feet long, 3 feet high. Slowly rising, slowly falling, like something beneath the surface had rolled onto its side. I reached for the radio again, but froze with it halfway to my mouth. The swell flattened, the sand smoothed, and then something trailed across it, a thin groove, as if a fingertip had dragged lightly along the surface. That was when fear finally began to take root. Not a sudden jolt, not panic, something colder, more patient, the kind of fear that wants you to keep watching so it can show you something worse. I backed away slowly, retracing my steps. The sand behind me moved again, sinking slightly where I had stepped, as if trying to erase some trace of me. I walked faster. By the time I returned to the concrete pad, my breath felt tight and metallic, and the back of my neck prickled with static electricity. Inside the outpost, I checked the seals, checked the vents, checked the locks twice. Everything was secure, but nothing about that security felt real. I kept looking at the sand through the windows, waiting for it to move again. I went to sleep eventually. The cot was stiff, and the air recycler hummed in slow, pulsing intervals. I drifted into a restless haze of half-dreams where the dunes rose and fell like chests breathing in unison. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with a feeling like someone had touched my shoulder. I sat up fast, heart thundering, but the room was empty. Only the faint sound of sand brushing lightly against the outer wall. I turned to look at my boots near the door. That was when my throat went dry. The footprints I had dragged in earlier were disappearing, one by one, slowly, methodically. The sand grains that had fallen from my boots lifted and rolled together, flattening the impressions, as though an invisible hand was smoothing them out. I watched for nearly a full minute. No breeze, no open vent, no vibration in the floor. Just the sand shifting entirely on its own, erasing every mark I had left. I did not move. I barely breathed. When the last print vanished, the sand settled completely and did not move again. Only then did I understand the rules were not warnings. They were survival instructions. And somehow, on the very first night, the desert had already begun responding to me. By the third day, I'd stopped trying to explain anything.
The radio still spat only static. The satellite feed hadn't updated in 48 hours, and every attempt I made to re-establish contact with base ended the same way. Screen flickers, frozen data, time codes that looped backward. But the worst part was how quickly I was beginning to accept it. Wake up, check the locks, scan the perimeter, watch the sand breathe. It had become a routine, a warped sense of normal, something to cling to. That morning, the heat was unbearable. Not just hot, suffocating. The kind of heat that presses against your skull and makes the world feel like it's vibrating at the edges. I poured water over my head just to stay focused. It was around noon when I saw him. At first, I thought it was a hallucination, a mirage, the kind your brain invents when it's baking under too much sun. But even at a distance, I knew it wasn't a trick of the light. A figure stood just beyond the outer fence, roughly 100 meters away, perfectly still. I squinted, stepped closer to the window. He was wearing a dark trench coat, odd out here considering the heat, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in deep shadow. No movement, no attempt to approach, just standing there like he'd been planted in the earth. Something about his posture was off. He wasn't standing straight. His shoulders sloped too far inward, as if his arms were too long. His neck angled slightly forward, like his head was too heavy. I reached for the binoculars. By the time I brought them to my eyes, he was gone. Not walking away, not fading like heat shimmer. Gone. The space where he stood was empty. Smooth sand, no footprints. I scanned the horizon. Nothing but dunes and stillness. I stepped outside onto the concrete, boots crunching against stray pebbles. The air stung my lungs. The light hurt my eyes. I moved to the edge of the fence, watching for any sign, any shift in the wind, any ripple in the sand. Still nothing. I stayed out there for maybe 10 minutes, pacing the perimeter, pretending I was in control of the situation. When I finally went back inside, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Not sulfur, not decay, just dust. Thick, dry, choking dust. Then I saw it. A trail of sand, leading from the threshold directly to my cot. Not scattered, not windblown. A perfect, continuous path. As if someone had walked in without boots, each step softly bleeding out grains behind them. I hadn't left the door open. I hadn't even unsealed the airlock. I stood at the entrance, heart pounding so hard I could feel it behind my eyes. The trail ended precisely at the edge of the mattress. Nothing more. No disturbance in the sheets, no signs of exit. Just that trail. Like a snake made of sand, it slithered across the floor, paused at my bed, and then disappeared. I walked forward slowly, following the path with my eyes. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to. There was something deliberate in the way it curved, too smooth to be accidental. It didn't fan outward like normal dust. It coiled. At the cot, I stopped. My pillow had a faint indentation in it, as if someone had pressed their hand there, just once, just long enough to leave an impression. I pressed my own hand against it. The shape was bigger than mine. I backed away, locked the door, sealed the secondary latch, then stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by systems that no longer worked and rules I didn't understand. Rule 6. If you see a man in a trench coat, do not engage. I had looked. I had reached for binoculars. I had gone outside. I went back to the printed sheet on the desk and ran my finger over the line. The lamination was beginning to curl at the edges. The ink had started to fade slightly, as if the rules themselves were wearing out, like they had been read too many times by people who never made it back. I spent the rest of the day inside, all blinds drawn, camera feeds open on every screen. Each monitor showed empty sand, stillness, boredom, safety, except for camera 4. That one glitched every 30 seconds, a flicker, a moment of static, and always during the exact same time window, 3:14 p.m. to 3:17 p.m. I watched it closely, rewound the footage, frame by frame. On the 4th playback, I saw it. One frame. A figure. Same coat, same wide-brimmed hat. Standing in the exact same place I had seen him earlier. But the timestamp was wrong. It was from the previous night, 2:03 a.m. And then again, 2 nights before that. Always between 2 and 3 a.m. Always facing the building. Always still. I shut off the monitor and backed away from the desk. My reflection in the dark glass of the screen looked pale and too thin, my eyes sunken like I hadn't slept in days. I remembered something the recruiter had said, half joking, "Don't worry, man." And maybe that was the worst part, because by day 3, I wasn't sure if the man in the trench coat was real, or if the desert had started making one for me. Rule number 4 was the one I mocked.
When I first read it, I actually laughed, out loud. Of all the ominous warnings on that laminated sheet, don't respond to voices, don't dig, don't move if something watches you, this one sounded like some janitor's passive-aggressive note. It made sense in theory. You didn't want to clog a delicate filtration system with sand, especially not out here where water was recycled and reused. But the tone was different. Not a maintenance rule, a survival rule, written with the same fatal seriousness as the others. I didn't care. It still felt ridiculous. By day 4, half the desert had migrated into the rec room. I'd taken to eating meals in there, an open room with dented metal walls, a bolted-down table, and a window overlooking the northern perimeter. The sand was subtle at first, a fine dust that crept in through the seams no matter how tightly I sealed the doors. Then it started piling, small dunes forming against the corners, thin trails leading under the furniture. Even with boots on, I could feel it through the floor, like a presence gathering grain by grain. After lunch, I grabbed a push broom from the utility closet. The silence made every bristle sound like a thunderclap. I worked slowly, more from the heat than caution. The broom pushed the sand in wide arcs, stirring up a faint smell I couldn't quite place. Not musty, not earthy, more like scorched air, hot metal, something dry at a level beyond physical dryness, like it had been dead for so long it forgot how to rot. I swept it all toward the floor drain at the center of the room. A square metal grate designed for spills or flooding, nothing unusual. It made sense to use it. Where else was I going to put it? The grains trickled through, hissing softly as they fell. I didn't think twice. That night, around 2 a.m.,
I woke to a sound I'd never heard in the outpost before. Water pressure. A hiss, then a metallic groan. I got up, heart already tapping too fast. The lights flickered as I crossed the hallway toward the sink. The sound was louder here, constant, like a valve forced open against its will. Then, a low clunk, and the hiss turned into a rush. The kitchen sink erupted. Not with water, not even with mud, with sand. Dry, bone dry, cascading up through the faucet like a geyser. It poured out, spraying against the backsplash, coating the counter. My brain stuttered in disbelief. There shouldn't have been that much sand in the filtration line. There couldn't have been.
I moved toward the sink, unsure what I was going to do. Block it? Shut off the feed? But before I could even touch it, the pipes beneath the counter groaned again, and the sink went silent. For one long, heavy second. Then the toilet in the back bathroom screamed. That's the only way I can describe it. A sudden, high-pitched pressure release followed by an explosive gurgle. I sprinted down the hall, flashlight slicing the dark. The toilet lid was already up. The bowl was brimming with sand, rising fast. It didn't bubble like water. It poured upward in a steady column, spilling onto the floor like an hourglass in reverse. The sand was clean, no debris, no color, but it moved. That's what broke me. It wasn't the impossibility of the source or the amount, or even the fact that the plumbing wasn't connected to the outside at all. It was how the sand shifted as it spread, curling at the edges, branching like roots, feeling around. I backed away, heart hammering against my ribs. The flashlight trembled in my hand. I could hear more behind me now, other drains, a subtle scratching, sinks, showers, vents. The whole outpost was hissing. I sprinted to the utility room and hit the master shutoff valve. The lights flickered once, then steadied. The hiss died, slowly, reluctantly. I stood in the dark for what felt like hours. When I returned to the rec room, the floor was coated in a thin layer of sand. The grate I had swept into was no longer visible, just a small mound where it had been, like the drain had rejected the offering. The next morning, I removed every drain cover and sealed them with duct tape. Kitchen, bathroom, rec room, shower, every pipe, every grate, every possible hole. Then I dragged the broom back to the supply closet and hung it on the wall like a crucifix. I didn't clean up the sand that remained. I let it stay. A quiet warning to myself. I looked at the rule sheet again, this time with reverence. Never sweep sand into the drains. It didn't say what would happen. It didn't need to. The rule wasn't about plumbing. It was about invitation. And I had already opened the door. By the 5th day, the sand stopped feeling like part of the environment and started feeling like part of me. It didn't come in through the door anymore. It didn't drift under the window seams like before. It appeared in the kinds of places sand has no right to be. My socks were the first sign. I kept them inside a sealed drawer, clean, folded, unused. But when I grabbed a fresh pair, they felt heavier. I shook them out, expecting maybe sweat or condensation from the temperature swings. Instead, a stream of fine sand spilled onto the floor. Not clumped, not stuck together. Perfectly dry, perfectly smooth. I checked the drawer. No cracks, no openings, no dust at the corners. But the sand was inside anyway, as if it had seeped through solid material or simply manifested where it wanted to be. I tried to laugh it off, tried to convince myself I was being dramatic, tried to pretend this could be explained by contamination or exhaustion or my own clumsiness. But the part of me that still believed in logic was already dying. Later that day, I found sand in my sheets. Not the coarse, gritty kind you pick up at a beach, not the stuff that makes you brush your legs off instinctively. This was finer, lighter, almost powdery, like dust from crushed bone or volcanic ash. It coated the bed in a thin layer that seemed to cling to fabric with static electricity. When I brushed it away, the grains stuck to my wrist, refusing to fall. I stripped the sheets and shook them out the door, but even then, I couldn't get rid of the sand. It bonded to the fibers, embedded itself. I gave up and slept on top of the blanket, careful not to pull anything over my skin. But it didn't matter. When I woke, the sand was on my arms, my chest, my neck. Not in piles, not in patches, a thin, uniform dusting, as if I had been lying in it all night. And then came the worst part, my toothbrush. It was inside a sealed plastic container, one of those travel cases with a snap-lock lid. When I opened it in the morning, the bristles were stiff. Then I saw why. Fine sand coated every strand, packed densely between them, as if someone had pushed it in with careful pressure. I stared at it for a long time. My hands didn't move. My breath barely did. The message was obvious. It wasn't just getting into the outpost. It was getting into me. I decided to shower, hoping the water pressure would wash the dust from my skin. The water came out clean, warm, forceful, one of the few comforts the outpost still offered. But the sand didn't rinse away. Instead, it spread. I felt the grains sliding across my skin in slow, deliberate patterns, like they were rearranging themselves, gathering, bonding. I scrubbed harder until my shoulders turned red, but the sand clung tighter. When I turned off the water, the grains remained in place, not wet, not dripping.
Dry as ever, as if the shower had never touched them. That was the first moment I understood the danger wasn't outside the outpost. It was already on me, already learning me, already seeing me as part of whatever rules governed this place. I went to the supply locker and pulled out the blacklight flashlight meant for leak detection. When I clicked it on, the room shifted into violet haze. At first, nothing stood out. Then I raised my arm. The sand lit up. Not bright, not like a glow stick or neon chemical, but a faint blue shimmer, subtle enough to miss unless you knew to look for it. The grains pulsed irregularly. Some flickered, others glowed steadily. The overall effect looked almost biological. I moved the light across my body. Every place the sand clung, it glowed. My shoulder, my fingers, the side of my throat, even my hairline. I swept the light across the room and saw faint trails leading from the bathroom door to the cot. Not footprints, not smears, more like the sand had crawled, left behind a luminous residue too fine to detect in normal light. Then I checked the inside of the shower. The drain was dry. No water pooled at the bottom, only sand, packed in a neat ring around the metal grate, as if something had risen from it, shaken itself off, then stepped out to follow me. I backed away slowly, every muscle tight, and reached for the laminated rule sheet on the desk. Not all rules are meant to be understood. Some are confessions from the dead. The air felt still, too still. The outpost hummed quietly, but underneath the machinery was another sound, a soft scraping, like a million grains shifting at once. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the walls, inside the vents, inside my clothes, inside me. I shut off the blacklight, but the faint impression of blue still haunted my vision. I couldn't unsee it, couldn't undo whatever had already begun. The sand wasn't debris. It wasn't intrusion. It was contact. And whatever it was, whatever it wanted, it had already claimed enough of me to make sure I wouldn't leave this place the same way I had arrived, if I left at all. 7 days, that was the assignment, not a day more. The deployment schedule was printed in black ink on the back of my authorization packet. I checked it the morning I arrived and again on day 2, just to be sure. A single week, rotational post, environmental monitoring only. A brief, isolated stint. High pay, no combat risk, no human contact needed. That was the promise.
On the 7th day, I woke early, showered, dressed in my cleanest uniform, shaved, sat by the door with my bag packed. I even brewed the last of the decent coffee, saving a cup for whoever was supposed to arrive to replace me. But the sky stayed empty. No chopper, no rumble, no shadows on the dunes. Just sun, just heat, just the same burning silence that had begun to feel permanent. I gave it an hour, then 2, then 4. By noon, I tried the radio again. Site 09 requesting confirmation of shift transition. Nothing. I changed channels, rechecked cables, powered down and rebooted the main terminal. Still nothing. Only that low, unchanging hiss, white noise that filled the cabin like fog. I opened the emergency sat phone, a thick black box that looked more like a weapon than a communication device. I'd been told it was fail-proof, that even in atmospheric disturbances or hardware disruption, it could pierce signal dead zones and reach base. I dialed the emergency line. Static. I entered the backup frequency. Static. I tried a direct digital ping to the nearest weather station. The screen lit up, blinked twice, then froze. Static. Nothing was getting out. No messages, no location pings, not even dead silence. Just loops, corrupted feedback, like the signals themselves had forgotten where they were supposed to go. I returned to the security room, sat down, brought up the landing pad camera feed, checked the timestamp. It read, Day 7/0603/27. I clicked play. A low-resolution loop began. The landing pad. Empty. Wind stirring the edge of a tarp. Shadows inching across the pad as the sun rose. In the far left corner of the frame, a small bird hovered mid-flight. I watched the loop play 5 times before I realized what was wrong. The bird never moved. Its wings didn't beat. It was just there, frozen in midair, pixels shimmering where its motion should have been. I scrubbed the footage forward. Time ticked ahead, 0604, 0605, but the footage didn't change. The same breeze, the same empty pad, the same frozen bird. 10 seconds, on repeat. I checked the system log. The feed had recorded the same 10 seconds for the last 48 hours. No data beyond that point. Nothing new, nothing after 0603:37. 1,000 loops of a moment that never finished. I pulled up the other cameras. Most showed the same thing. Looping snippets, repeating segments of nothing. A frame frozen, a shadow locked in place. Even the Outpost's internal hallway camera showed a version of me walking past, again and again, except I never walked that hall at that time. I stared at myself in the loop. Back straight, blank face, moving in silence. It wasn't me, not the way I remembered. The man in the footage didn't feel like me. I shut the monitors off. For the first time since arriving, I opened the supply locker and pulled out the emergency flare gun, loaded it, stepped outside. The heat was intense, windless, dead. I raised the flare gun and fired. The signal arced high into the sky, red and brilliant. It screamed as it climbed, then burst into a red cloud against the pale blue sky. The desert watched silently. The flare fizzled into ash. I waited. 10 minutes, then 20. No sound, no sign of movement. Just the endless dunes, shifting in slow, imperceptible ways. That night, I sat by the main terminal and scrolled back through every recorded message sent to this outpost in the last 3 months. I wanted proof. I wanted names. I wanted to believe someone had ever actually been here before me. But the files were fragmented, redacted. Some entries were blank. One message stood out. It was dated almost a year ago, .mp4, and the sender ID was blank. I clicked it. A video opened. Grainy footage, shaky, taken inside the outpost. The same walls, same desk, same hallway. The camera focused on a man's face, middle-aged, gaunt. His eyes were rimmed in red like he hadn't slept in weeks.
Sand clung to his skin in clumps. His voice shook as he whispered, "They don't come back for you. It doesn't end. They send you here because it wants someone. Every shift is the last shift." The feed cut out. I sat back in my chair. In the corner of the room, the sand near the floor vent began to stir again. Not blowing, not shifting from air pressure. Rising, as if drawn upward by something hungry. I turned off the lights. There was no point waiting at the door anymore. No one was coming. Whatever this place was, whatever it was meant to hold, it wasn't a station. It was a cage. And I was the latest offering. Nights at the outpost had begun to stretch. They felt longer than they should have, like time itself softened after sunset. The clocks kept their rhythm, but something in the atmosphere did not. The dark pressed closer to the windows. The air grew thicker. Even the hum of the generators changed pitch, as if struggling to hold back the silence that wanted to swallow everything.
It was around midnight when I first heard the voices. Not whispers exactly, more like vibrations. Muffled, distant, rising through the floor in slow waves, blending with the hum of the coolant system. At first, I thought it was plumbing, maybe a pressure leak or shifting metal. But the longer I listened, the clearer it became that the sounds had rhythm, cadence, intention. I was sitting at the desk, half asleep, reviewing camera loops that had begun to repeat in patterns I no longer trusted. My eyelids were heavy, my skin felt coated with grit I could never fully wipe away. Then a faint sound rose through the floor, brushing against the soles of my boots. I froze. It continued, soft, steady, almost conversational under the boards. Low tones that rose slightly, then fell. The cadence was unmistakable. Voices. More than one. I pushed my chair back, heart hammering in the quiet room. The sound stopped, dead, as if it sensed my movement. I waited, breath held inside a chest that felt too tight. Then it came again. A whispering drag, like syllables being pushed through water. I grabbed my flashlight and moved toward the far wall, where the vent panel sat, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. A thin metal grate, painted the same dull gray as everything else. I crouched down, bringing my ear close. The voices faded, replaced by something else. Breathing. Wet. Slow. Thick. Not the breath of something sleeping peacefully. Something heavier. Something that struggled for each inhale, dragging air like it weighed too much. A low gurgle followed. My stomach tightened, sweat prickled down my spine. I pulled back. The panel was secured with 6 heavy padlocks, each rusted but solid, industrial grade. None matched any key I had been issued. I tried to pull on the grate anyway, desperation making me irrational. It didn't budge. It might as well have been welded into the wall. The Outpost manual never mentioned anything about a crawl space. No maintenance tunnel, no lower level, nothing at all beneath the structure. But something was there. I walked the perimeter of the floor, shining my flashlight along the baseboards. The sounds didn't follow me, but every so often a soft thump traveled through the concrete, faint enough to doubt, but strong enough to feel. Once, near the center of the room, I caught the faintest echo of a single word. I didn't recognize the language, didn't know if it was a language, but the sound was deliberate, shaped, directed upward. Calling. The lights flickered. My breath hitched. I shut off the flashlight and stood in the dark, listening. The breathing returned, louder this time, wet gulps, followed by a slow exhale that rattled like fluid shifting inside lungs. Then another whisper. Then 2, overlapping, growing more urgent, as if they sensed the dark had given them permission to be louder. The floor beneath me vibrated. Just a little, just enough. I stepped back, letting instinct take over. My mind wanted to rationalize, but my body knew better. Every primal reflex screamed at me to stay away, to not acknowledge whatever lived under the boards. I moved to the opposite side of the room and switched on the overhead lights. The voices stopped instantly. The outpost fell silent again, except for the faint mechanical hum that now seemed too small to fill the room. I sat on the edge of the cot, forcing my breath to steady. I checked the padlocks again from a distance. Their metal glinted in the stark lighting, each one firmly sealed. Who had locked them? How long ago? And what was it meant to keep inside? Or keep out? I didn't sleep that night. Every few minutes, a faint tapping came from the grate. Always 3 taps in a row. Soft, hollow, like knuckles or claws trying to test the metal. Sometimes the taps came from directly below my feet. Sometimes farther across the floor. Around 3:20 a.m., the breathing returned. Closer now, as if pressed against the underside of the panel. A long inhale, a watery exhale, a whisper I could almost understand. I covered my ears, but felt the sound in my bones anyway. Something was beneath me. Something awake. Something listening. Before dawn, I forced myself to crouch by the panel one more time. The padlocks were unmoved, the grate undisturbed. But there, along the edge of the floor, was a line of sand, a thin trail barely visible. It had not been there before. I knelt closer. The sand quivered when I exhaled onto it, alive, as if responding, as if mimicking breath. I backed away slowly until my shoulders hit the wall. The rule sheet on the desk lay in clear view, illuminated by the dim morning light. I knew every rule by heart now, but I checked anyway, scanning each line as if a new one might appear. But the rules said nothing about the voices, nothing about the locked crawl space, nothing about the breathing below. Which meant there were rules no one had written down, rules learned only by those who heard the whispers. Rules for those who survived long enough to understand the difference between the outpost above the sand and the thing beneath it. It was morning when I left the outpost again, not long after sunrise. The light was soft enough to cast long shadows, but the heat hadn't yet begun its usual assault. I wasn't on an assigned patrol. No rule told me to leave. No protocol suggested it. I left because I had to, because the air inside felt too tight and the voices under the floor had started humming in rhythm with my breath. I headed east, toward the highest ridge I could see from the rooftop camera. I figured it might give me a wider view of the perimeter, maybe a glimpse of the chopper that never came, or signs of life beyond the dunes. I took only what I needed: a canteen, a flare gun, the old laminated rule sheet folded in my back pocket, and the outpost's rangefinder. I didn't bring a radio. I'd stopped pretending that static was communication. The sand shifted beneath my boots like always, but it felt more cooperative than usual, less like it was resisting me, more like it wanted me to get somewhere, like it was guiding. I walked for almost 2 hours. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a shadow, just a strange play of light on the dunes, a darker strip where the slope dipped. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't an illusion. It was a trench. A perfectly straight gouge in the earth, about 10 feet wide, and so long I couldn't see where it ended. The desert just split open, like someone had drawn a blade through it and forgotten to close the wound. I stood at the edge, boots an inch from the drop. It was wrong. Too symmetrical. The walls of the trench weren't eroded or crumbling. They were smooth, like cut marble. The sand didn't pour into it. It stopped at the lip, refusing to fall, held back by some invisible barrier or force. I dropped to one knee and looked down. There was no bottom. Not in the way a cave has a floor or a canyon has depth. This was blackness that rejected light, a pure, endless vertical void. I picked up a small rock and tossed it in. No sound, no impact, no end. It simply vanished, swallowed. I stood back up and steadied my hand as I reached for the flare gun, loaded a single round, raised it directly above the trench, fired. The flare screamed downward, trailing red smoke. Then, nothing. No flash, no bounce, No echo. It was just gone. Not consumed, not broken. Erased. I stumbled back from the edge, pulse pounding. That wasn't a hole. It was an absence. A negative space in the desert. Something that had no right to exist. Not cut by man, not shaped by wind, not made by erosion or time. It was intention. That's what terrified me most. This trench had purpose, and it had been here long before the outpost, maybe before the desert itself. I circled it cautiously, walking parallel to its edge. It never changed width, never curved, just extended on forever, cutting the dunes like a scar across the earth. 10 minutes, 20, still going. I couldn't help but feel it moved slightly when I wasn't looking, like it breathed sideways, adjusting its place in the world. A trick of the light maybe, but the air above it shimmered faintly, like heat mirage without heat. I found no footprints near the trench, no marks, no signs that anyone had been here before. But deep inside me, I knew that wasn't true. Someone had stood where I was standing now. Someone had peered into this same void. And someone had dropped more than a flare. I stood at the edge again and called out, not expecting a reply. The echo came, not from the trench, but from behind me. My own voice, delayed and warped, drifting in from the dunes. I turned, heart stuttering. No one there. But the echo lingered, carried on the wind longer than it should have. Then I heard a new sound, a faint, rhythmic scratching. Not from the trench, but from below the sand at my feet. I backed away, fast. The scratching followed, grains shifting, like claws or limbs dragging themselves through the dunes below. I turned and walked quickly, not running, not yet. The sun was higher now, but I felt colder than I had all morning. I didn't look back. Not until I reached the outpost and sealed the doors behind me. Only then did I check the perimeter cameras again, panning slowly east. The trench was gone. Not visible. Not even a disturbance. Just smooth, untouched sand. Like it had never been there. But I knew it had. I could still smell it. A strange absence of smell. Like dust that never had a beginning. Like rock that had never seen sunlight. I returned to the flare gun and checked the chamber. Empty. The spent shell was gone, as if the flare had never existed either. I sat down, pressing my hands against the floor, grounding myself with solid metal, with reality, with anything that felt permanent. But the floor was warm. Not from the sun, not from the systems, from below. I closed my eyes and saw it again, an endless wound in the sand, waiting for something to fall in. And the terrible thought returned. Maybe it wasn't a trench. Maybe it was a mouth. Night at the outpost had become something I dreaded. The dark did not just fall here, it settled, it thickened, it pressed against the windows like a physical thing. The generators hummed steadily, but everything else grew unnaturally quiet, as if the desert held its breath after sunset. I was reviewing footage from earlier in the day when the motion detector pinged. A single chime, soft but unmistakable. The screen blinked. Camera 4, north side of the perimeter. I felt my pulse climb as I reached for the keyboard. I hesitated for a moment, then I switched to the live feed. At first, I thought there was a glitch. The image was too still, too clean. The sand was untouched, smoothed by the windless night. The floodlights washed everything in pale color. The fencing cast long shadows. And there it was, a figure, human-shaped, standing perfectly still at the outer edge of the floodlight glow. My skin crawled instantly. Its proportions were wrong. Shoulders too narrow, legs too long, posture slightly bent forward as if its spine was bowed or its head was too heavy. It wore something dark that blended with the night, but its outline was unmistakable. It was facing the camera, facing me. I turned off my breathing for a second, just from shock. Then I leaned closer, slow and careful. The figure did not move, not even a twitch, not the sway of someone shifting weight, not the natural bob of quiet breathing, absolutely motionless. I tried to zoom the camera. The feed stuttered, then sharpened slightly. I still could not make out a face, but the shape of its head seemed off, elongated, tilted slightly, as if listening. I whispered to myself without meaning to. The figure did not respond, did not tilt, did not stir. A memory surfaced sharply. Rule 8. If it watches, do not move. I had dismissed it as something metaphorical, some psychological suggestion meant to keep people from panicking. But now the words tightened around my chest like a held breath. It watches. And it was watching. I reached for the monitor controls to switch cameras, but my hand stopped halfway. The rule echoed louder in my mind. Do not move. I froze completely. I did not even blink for several seconds. A strange instinct took over. A primal stillness, as if movement might trigger something final and irreversible. The figure remained exactly where it was. Minutes passed, then more. I checked the time without shifting my gaze too much. 11:47 p.m. The figure did not blink, did not shift. The floodlight did not distort it. It looked carved out of the night, like a statue someone had planted outside just to test my sanity. My shoulders ached from tension. Sweat collected at the base of my spine despite the cold. The silence felt like weight. Another thought crept in slowly. How long had it been watching me before the detector picked it up? Was it standing there while I slept on previous nights, hidden just out of range, studying the building until it learned the rhythm of my movements? I swallowed, and even that small sound made my heart skip. I waited. The minutes stretched thinner and thinner until they felt like threads ready to snap. My eyes began to sting from the strain of not looking away. Sometime after midnight, a faint movement flickered at the bottom of the screen. At first, I thought it was the figure. I almost gasped. But then I realized it was the sand, a small ripple near the figure's feet, like something beneath the surface had shifted. The figure itself remained unchanged. The sand rippled again, then stilled. The figure did not react. It simply continued standing there, facing the camera, its silhouette framed in stark light. I whispered again without intending to. Nothing. No response. Not a hint of motion. Just unwavering attention. The hours dragged. 2 a.m. 3. My legs were numb. My back felt locked. My breath came slow and shallow because I was terrified that even a heavy exhale might count as movement. I checked the timestamp again. 4:21 a.m. The figure remained. Dawn approached in creeping increments. A faint blue tint crept along the horizon, visible even through the camera. Light began to dilute the darkness. For the first time all night, the figure shifted. Not much. Its head tilted slightly upward, as if sensing the change in sky. Then the long, thin shape of its body softened, losing definition as the rising light blurred the shadows. It stepped back. One step. Slow. Deliberate. It did not turn around. It simply receded into the dark edge of the dune, like something melting back into the sand rather than walking across it. Within a minute, it was gone. No footprints remained. The motion detector turned silent again. I sat there until sunlight fully hit the windows. Only then did I allow my body to collapse forward, elbows on the desk, breath shaking out of me in uneven bursts. I checked the footage again. The figure was there in every frame of the night, unmoving, watching, studying me with silent patience. The flare gun on the table looked meaningless now. The reinforced doors felt thin. The walls felt hollow. I finally understood why the rule existed. Some things do not attack. They observe, they wait, and they never blink. By the 10th day, I no longer trusted the sky. The sun rose and fell as always, but something in its rhythm had started to falter. The light shifted too quickly. The The shadows stretched too far. It was like watching the desert breathe, slow and deliberate, and knowing that its lungs were not made for air. I noticed it at noon. The desert was quiet, blanketed in the thick white heat that made the air wobble. The horizon rippled and the dunes shimmered, but that was normal. That was something I could still explain. Until I saw the outpost. Not the one I was standing in, not the one behind me with its rusted vents and flickering lights and the cold hum of machines that had begun to feel like organs. A second outpost. Far across the sand, maybe half a mile to the south. Identical in shape. Same antennas, same solar panel layout, same faded number on the side. 09. I blinked, wiped the sweat from my eyes, stepped outside with the heat licking at my face, and stared directly at it. It didn't vanish. It just stood there, perfect, real, tangible. For a long time I thought it was a mirage, a reflection of heat and light, some optical ghost caused by dehydration or sleep deprivation. But the longer I stared, the more I felt something twist inside me. Because the angles weren't warped, the shape didn't flicker, it cast a shadow. I went back inside and launched the drone. I hadn't used it in days. The last time I tried, it refused to connect to the GPS, but now it booted cleanly, hummed with artificial life, and hovered into the sky like it knew where to go. I guided it toward the duplicate outpost. As it approached, the screen displayed the image clearly. Same walls, same layout, same everything. Except, someone was standing outside. Someone wearing my clothes. I leaned closer, squinting at the monitor. It was me. Down to the boots, the folded sleeves, even the duct tape on my left glove.
Standing just outside the door, arms loose at my sides, face angled upward toward the drone. Then I raised one hand, and on the screen, I waved. A slow, unsettling wave. But I wasn't waving. I wasn't outside. I was in the control room, watching, frozen. The figure, my copy, lowered its hand, turned toward the door, and walked back inside the building. The drone's camera followed. The door opened automatically. It stepped into the airlock and vanished from view. I felt cold seep into my spine. This wasn't a mirage. It was a copy, a perfect twin. The drone feed began to jitter. Static crept into the corners. Then the video froze on a frame of the hallway inside that second outpost. I recognized the frame immediately, because I had seen it before, on my own monitor 5 days ago, when I had reviewed footage and seen myself walking a hallway I didn't remember walking. That hallway, that same movement, that same version of me. A slow dread filled my chest. I tried to rewind the feed, but the drone cut out. I stared at the frozen image for a long time before closing the console. Outside, the horizon shimmered again, but the second outpost was no longer visible. I stepped out into the sunlight, shielding my eyes, searching the landscape. Nothing. Just windless dunes. It was gone, like it had never been there. I stood there in the heat, heart racing, skin beginning to burn, and realized something deeply wrong. If it was a mirage, it should have followed the rules of light. If it was a hallucination, it shouldn't have shown me what I hadn't yet imagined. But the copy had moved before I did. It waved first, like it knew I was watching, like it expected me. I went back inside and shut every door, every hatch, every blind. The interior felt suddenly smaller, more brittle, a house of mirrors wrapped in sand. I passed by the hallway where the vent panel sat. The padlocks were still in place, but I heard something beneath them. Not whispers this time. Mimicry. Breath matching my own. Inhale when I inhaled, hold when I held, exhale when I exhaled. The walls were listening, or worse, practicing. I sat at the desk and unfolded the laminated rule sheet again, the creases deepening with every reread. I scanned each line, slower this time, begging the ink to offer a new warning. But the rules had nothing about copies, Nothing about reflections that act before you do. I thought of the flare gun again, but what good would it do? Shoot it at myself? Would the flare vanish like before? Would I vanish? The longer I stared at the door, the more I wondered if I had already stepped outside, if I had already become the one who waved, if the real me was still here, or if I had never arrived at all. Maybe the outpost was not a place. Maybe it was a reflection, a mirage that had begun to hold shape too long, and I was the echo that refused to fade. It happened at exactly 2:14 a.m. I know the time because I was staring at the monitor when the hum changed. That low mechanical drone the outpost always makes, it shifted, subtly at first. A deeper vibration, like someone had tuned the whole building one note lower. Then the floor began to tremble. Not violently, not like an earthquake. It was smaller than that, focused, localized. A fine trembling, like the walls had started to shiver from the inside out. I stood up, heart pounding, and placed my palm flat against the floor. It was alive with motion, not above, below. Something massive was moving under the foundation, too slow to be machinery, too purposeful to be wind. The lights flickered. I grabbed the flashlight and followed the tremors, moving down the hall barefoot to avoid making noise. My boots sat by the bed, but I didn't risk the time or the sound to put them on. The vibration led me to the east wing, to the sealed hallway I rarely entered. The air changed as I stepped inside. Stale, heavier, a metallic tang like blood left too long in the sun. I rounded the corner and froze. There was a crack in the concrete floor, a new one. It hadn't been there yesterday. Thin, jagged, barely wide enough to fit a fingertip, but spreading. At its center, a small mound of sand was pushing up through the gap, spilling onto the floor in slow motion. The sand wasn't falling inward, it was rising, climbing from beneath. I crouched beside it, eyes wide, breath shallow. The grains moved with unnatural rhythm, not random, not drifting, crawling upward in a tight column. Then I saw it, the first shape. At first I thought it was a cable, then maybe a root. A long black strand curled upward from the crack, wet, glistening faintly. It slid through the sand like a snake through water. Then another appeared beside it, and another. 4, 5, 6. Thin, segmented, fingers. They weren't reaching upward. They were testing, tapping softly against the floorboards from underneath, one by one, as if counting the distance to the surface, as if measuring the thickness between us. I stumbled backward, falling hard against the opposite wall. The flashlight shook in my hand. I pointed it at the crack, and for a split second, the fingers froze. Then they responded. The tapping increased, faster, more urgent, not frantic, but deliberate, like they recognized the light, like they had waited for it. I shut it off immediately. Darkness swallowed the hall. The tapping stopped. I held my breath. And in that silence, I felt it. Through the floor, through the walls, through the air itself. A presence shifting just below my feet. Huge, winding, folding over itself. Something deep. The fingers withdrew slowly, retreating into the crack like worms into soil. The sand stopped rising. The floor went still. I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, I crawled forward, flashlight still off, and examined the crack again. It hadn't widened. The sand had settled. But where the fingers had touched, the concrete looked different, stained, smoothed, as if the surface had been caressed by something ancient. I backed away slowly, step by step. I sealed off the hallway with every bolt I could find, pushed furniture against the entrance, taped over the bottom of the door. Then I sat on the floor of the main room, flashlight in one hand, flare gun in the other, listening to the building breathe. The rule sheet was still on the desk beside me. I read each line again.
Still nothing about the thing beneath. Still no mention of fingers. Still no instruction for what to do when it tries to come in. It felt personal now. Not like a system malfunction, not like environmental collapse, not even like an entity exploring out of curiosity. This thing knew me, knew where I moved, knew how I slept, knew how to reach from the one place I never thought to look, below. I kept vigil until dawn. The outpost remained quiet. Nothing emerged again, but I could feel it down there, coiled and listening, its fingers memorizing the blueprint of my fear. I thought of the trench I had seen on the ridge, the scar in the dunes that swallowed light. This wasn't separate from that. This was that. A continuation, a root system, a body stretched across the desert in segments we were never meant to measure. And it was getting closer. I had read the rules so many times that the ink had begun to blur in my memory. But somehow, in all those rereads, my eyes must have skimmed over one of the most important lines. It was buried near the bottom, phrased in the same plain language as the others.
Never sleep facing the dunes. I never questioned it, never tried to interpret it. It sounded like something written for comfort, not survival, a suggestion rather than a command. But the night before, when I rearranged the cot to face the window, I was not thinking about rules. I was thinking about airflow, about the faint draft that made it easier to fall asleep. After days of hallucinations and voices and tunnel vibrations, I just wanted to breathe something that felt like night air. If there was any part of me that remembered the rule in that moment, it stayed silent. The mistake revealed itself at 3:11 a.m. I woke with my back pinned to the mattress, not by weight, by nothing at all. Paralysis. My arms refused to move, my legs refused to twitch. My chest struggled against some invisible pressure, as if the air had thickened and grown heavy inside my lungs. The window rattled, soft at first, then harder, a steady, rhythmic clatter, like something outside was knocking its forehead against the glass. I tried to turn my head, could not. I tried to inhale. The air fought me. The pressure in the room built, compressing the silence into something almost solid. The walls creaked, the floor groaned beneath the cot. My ears popped, as though the atmospheric weight in the outpost had doubled. Then I noticed the light, the faintest glow on the window, not warm, not cool, a pale, dead illumination, like the reflection of moonlight through dust. Sand. I saw it before I heard it. A sheet of sand pressed against the exterior of the glass, sliding downward in slow, thick streams. At first, it looked like the wind had kicked up a storm, but the dunes were windless tonight, dead still. The sand was piling upward, not blowing against the window, climbing it. Layer by layer, the grains stacked themselves as though pulled by some quiet gravity. I heard it accumulate in waves, a soft hiss that grew heavier with each second. My heartbeat hammered in my skull. Then I saw the first face. A ripple in the sand at the top corner of the window, a shift in the texture, and then a mouth formed, pressed outward from the mass of grains, lips stretching thin, teeth made of tiny, shimmering particles. The face did not blink. It did not breathe. It only pressed closer, trying to form expression with something that should not have been capable of expression. Another face beside it, then another. Dozens pushing outward, all different. Some stretched, some childlike. Some distorted beyond anything human. Their features shifted as the grains crawled and rearranged themselves. I tried to scream. Nothing left my throat. The hissing outside intensified. More sand climbed the glass. More faces formed. Some looked frozen in terror, others in anger, others in an uncanny neutrality, like masks shaped from memory. The window bulged inward slightly, bending under pressure. Then came the sound from inside. a soft trickling. I dragged my eyes downward. Sand was spilling into the room from beneath the window frame. Not blown, not shaken loose. It was pouring in a perfect line, forming a growing mound beside the cot. Faces began to form inside too, first on the floor, then on the wall, then directly beside the bed, where the sand rose higher and higher, lifting itself into shapes that never fully completed. Eyes formed, then dissolved. A nose emerged, then scattered. Smiles stretched and collapsed. All watching me, all leaning toward me, all made of the dunes I had turned my face toward when I fell asleep. The pressure in the room intensified again. The walls vibrated, the ceiling groaned. A deep, low hum filled the air, like the outpost itself was being compressed from the outside. Never sleep facing the dunes. Now I understood. The rule was not about comfort. It was about invitation. The outpost itself was a barrier, a boundary. It kept whatever lived in the dunes on the outside when the sun fell. But where I looked and how I slept mattered. The desert recognized attention. It recognized orientation. And last night, when I repositioned the bed to face the window, I had acknowledged it. I had given it a direction to follow. The sand faces leaned closer, their grainy surfaces shifting like they were breathing me in. The paralysis loosened just enough for my right hand to twitch. Then again. Slowly, painfully, I dragged it across the mattress until my fingers brushed the edge of the sheet. I curled them, pulled, shifted my weight. Inch by inch, I turned my head away from the window. The pressure in the room broke instantly. The faces collapsed. The sand on the glass dropped in one silent sheet. The mound beside the cot fell flat, spilling back under the frame like water seeking the lowest point. The window stopped rattling. The outpost exhaled. I sucked in a full breath for the first time in minutes and rolled onto my side, gasping, shaking uncontrollably. My skin felt coated with cold sweat. My throat tasted like metal. When I dared to look again, the window was clear. Only a thin line of sand remained where the mass had been pressed against it, a smear of grains like fingerprints. The rule I never respected whispered through my mind. Never sleep facing the dunes. I turned the bed back to its original position before the sun rose, then taped over the window for good measure. After that night, I slept with my back against the wall and the rule sheet under my pillow. I did not need to reread it, because now I knew the dunes did not just move. They watched, and they wanted to be seen. I told myself I wouldn't break any more rules. Not after the drain, not after the window, not after the thing that stared from outside without blinking for hours until my mind almost snapped. But that morning something changed. The sun rose slow and red, casting strange shadows across the dunes like bruises on the land. The air felt thick even before noon, vibrating faintly like sound without a source. The rules could no longer hold the weight of what I needed to know. So I broke another one. Never dig into the sand beyond the perimeter. Rule 7. I had memorized it. I had ignored it. I packed a canteen, took the short shovel from the emergency gear locker, and headed east. I didn't have a plan, no coordinates, no destination. I just walked in the direction the wind had avoided for days. Roughly 5 minutes from the outpost, the air changed again. Not in temperature, but in tone. The sound of my steps dulled, as if the ground beneath me had become hollow. That's where I stopped. I drove the shovel into the sand. At first it resisted, heavy, compact, but then a few inches down, the resistance vanished. The sand gave way with a soft sigh. I stepped back, confused, then leaned forward and dug faster. The ground collapsed under me before I could react. I dropped through. No scream, just the soft rush of falling through silence. I landed hard, the wind knocked out of me. Sand poured in around my shoulders as I rolled to my side, coughing, blinking in the dim light that filtered through the narrow hole above. I was in a tunnel. A long, smooth-walled corridor carved through sand and stone, stretching in both directions, farther than my flashlight could reach. But it wasn't the tunnel that made me freeze. It was the bones. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Fossilized, embedded into the walls like they had been consumed by the earth and frozen mid-scream. Not piled, not scattered, placed.
One by one, in a line, head to toe, arms at their sides. I crawled forward, flashlight sweeping over the walls. The bones were humanoid, but not entirely human. Too tall, too thin, ribs shaped wrong, pelvis elongated, spinal curves unnatural. And the skulls. God, the skulls. Each one stared back at me. Wide, open eye sockets, all facing forward, none tilted, none turned, as if they had all died staring at the same thing, watching something that approached in silence. They weren't broken, they weren't shattered, they were preserved, clean, almost reverent. I moved deeper into the tunnel, drawn forward despite every instinct. The air grew colder. The sand underfoot began to feel damp, clinging to my boots in thick layers. And then the walls began to change. The further I went, the more intentional it became. The fossils gave way to carvings, deep, etched lines forming symbols I didn't recognize. Circles inside circles, spines drawn through silhouettes, eyes upon eyes upon eyes. And in the center of it all, at the far end of the corridor, a single wall of stone blocked the passage. At its center, a hollow, not a doorway, not a gate, just an indentation, shaped like a face. I stepped closer, and the flashlight flickered, once, then twice. Then the beam landed on something at my feet, a skull. Not fossilized, not dry, recent. Still pink in the eye sockets, still wet at the base. My breath caught. It was looking up at me. I turned and saw the others. More skulls, arranged carefully in the sand at even intervals. Every one of them recent. Every one of them staring upward, toward the ceiling, toward me. I stumbled backward and raised the light to the walls. All the old bones, all the old skulls. Now their sockets glowed faintly. A soft, impossible shimmer. Not reflection, not moisture. Awareness. I wasn't in a tomb. I was in a nursery. A place where something planted its dead like seeds. Watching, waiting. The bones were not laid to rest. They were arranged. A warning, or a ritual. I turned to leave. The tunnel had shifted behind me. The way I had come in, gone. Not collapsed, not filled in, replaced by smooth, uninterrupted stone. I spun in a slow circle, flashlight beam jittering with every breath. No exits, no sounds, no airflow. Only rows of skulls, watching silently, waiting for me to join them. My breath turned ragged. I dropped to my knees and began digging with my hands, clawing at the floor, trying to find the weak spot, the seam, the illusion that had let me in. I dug until my fingernails bled, until my skin blistered. Then I felt it, a thin crack in the wall. I wedged my fingers in, pulled, and the wall gave slightly. I pushed harder. Sand rained down from the ceiling. A vibration spread through the corridor. The bones rattled. And then, light. A shaft of light opened above me. I scrambled upward, using elbows and knees, dirt filling my throat, sand in my eyes. My shoulder screamed as I pushed through the last layer of earth and rolled back onto the open desert floor. I lay there for minutes, coughing, blinking against the sun. The outpost stood in the distance, farther away than it should have been. I looked back at the hole I had crawled out of, but there was nothing, just smooth, undisturbed sand. No tunnel, no collapse, no skulls, just silence. I stood and walked slowly toward the outpost. Behind me, in the back of my skull, I could still feel them. Watching, not angry, just waiting, for me to return. or for something else to come and take my place. There comes a point when survival instincts override rules, override fear, override curiosity. A moment when your mind decides that whatever lies beyond the horizon has to be better than what is closing in behind you. I reached that moment the morning after the buried skulls. My hand still shook from clawing my way out of the sand. My fingernails were cracked and blackened with dried blood. My body felt hollow. I needed to leave. Not later, not eventually, now. I powered up the beacon console and forced the system to accept new coordinates. Manual override, local geotag, emergency extraction route. The numbers blinked red across the screen, then steadied. For a brief moment, that blinking felt like hope. I packed 2 canteens, the flare gun, a compass, and the laminated rule sheet, out of instinct more than trust. I stepped outside and chose a direction at random, west, away from the trench, away from the tunnel, away from the faces. I walked. At first, the dunes shifted under my feet in familiar ways, a steady rise and fall. The sand clung to my boots, then released. The wind was non-existent, the heat suffocating. But the sky above looked wrong, not cloudy, not hazy, just frozen. The sun was tilted at an angle that should belong to late afternoon, yet the air carried the sharp bite of early morning.
Still, I kept walking. After 20 minutes, I crested a dune and looked back. The outpost was closer than it should have been. I frowned, wiped sweat from my forehead, and kept moving. The compass needle jittered, then stilled, pointing confidently north, even though I was heading west. I ignored it. Another half hour passed. I crested another dune. The outpost stood below me again, exactly as it had looked when I left it. The antenna, the concrete pad, the small shadow beside the entrance where my pack had sat earlier. Only now a figure stood near the door. My breath caught. It looked like me. Or maybe it was just a shadow, a trick of the heat. I turned away and descended the opposite side of the dune. I did not want to see more copies of myself. I did not want to see anything that proved I was no longer anchored in reality. I headed south this time. The sand grew coarser, warmer. Not from the sun, but from something beneath the surface, shifting in slow rolling waves, pushing heat upward in pulses like breath. I ignored it. Another hour. My canteen grew lighter. My legs felt unsteady. I climbed the next dune and nearly dropped the compass. The outpost sat directly below me. Same building, same angle, same everything. A loop. Not metaphorical, a physical loop carved into the land. I turned sharply and headed east, almost sprinting until my lungs burned. 10 minutes. 15. The ground hardened here, the sand flattening into a smooth sheet. My boots left shallow prints that lasted only seconds before the surface rippled and erased them. I began to sense movement beneath the dunes again, something burrowing or following. I crested a ridge and stopped. The outpost again. But this one was different. The windows were shattered. The antenna bent. Dark stains marked the front door. I stared at it, frozen. My brain tried to stitch the differences together, comparing them to the real one. This version looked damaged, abandoned, older by decades, as if it represented a future the desert had already decided for me. I turned away before it could invite me closer. North. Another direction, another chance. The sand whispered against my boots as I walked, a subtle hiss, a soft drag. Not quite wind and not quite movement, more like speech. I quickened my pace, but the whisper followed. The sky still had not changed. The sun had not moved. Its unnatural angle made the landscape feel staged, like a backdrop clinging to a single frame of time. I walked until my legs felt heavy. When I finally stopped and looked up, I felt something inside me tear. The outpost was there, perfectly intact, waiting. This time, the sign above the door read the same faded number as mine. The solar panels glinted. A shadow passed in front of the window, as if someone inside was pacing. A whisper rose from the sand near my feet. Stay.
The word did not come from a voice, it came from vibration, from the grains themselves. A soft resonance that traveled up my legs and into my ribs. Stay. Another ripple in the sand. Stay. My chest tightened, my breath stalled. I dropped to my knees, pressing my palm flat to the ground. It moved under my hand, slowly, gently, as if reassuring me, as if promising protection. The sensation was not hostile. It was possessive. Stay. I forced myself back onto my feet and stumbled away. My heart hammered so loud it drowned out thought. I shut my eyes and ran, choosing no direction at all. Up the dune, down the other side, across the hard sand, through heat that blurred my vision. When I opened my eyes again, the outpost loomed ahead, and the door was open, waiting, inviting. The loop was not a boundary, it was design, an enclosure, a maze that led only inward no matter where you stepped. The sand hissed again behind me. Stay. I felt the meaning beneath the word, ancient and hungry. Not a command, a promise, a claim. I shut the outpost door behind me and collapsed onto the floor. The lights flickered, the air thickened. I felt the desert settle around the structure, like a giant closing its hand. There was no leaving. Not by foot, not by beacon, not by intention. I was part of the loop now, and the loop wanted me to stay. I stopped sleeping after the third loop, not because of fear, not entirely, because sleep had become untrustworthy. Time here was already breaking in ways I couldn't measure. The sun did not move, the shadows stayed the same length across entire days. My body tired, but the night never came. Or maybe it came and stayed, and the sun was only a shell placed in the sky to fool me. The outpost became quieter too, not silent, just waiting. Every system still ran, lights, doors, climate control. But the hum of the machines no longer comforted me. It felt artificial now, like background noise in a theater, looping on an endless reel to convince the audience the story had not yet ended. But it had. I knew it had. The rules didn't stop anything.
They only explained how to endure it longer. Still, I had one hope left: communication. I tore open the antenna housing that afternoon, pulled cables from the backup satellite array, rewired every dish, even the half-buried one mounted into the concrete behind the outpost. I linked them all to the emergency signal processor. The manuals warned not to do that. Too much signal bleed, too much risk of damaging the transceiver, too much chance of sending corrupted data. But I didn't care. I wasn't trying to be clean. I wasn't trying to ask for permission. I just needed to scream. I powered up the interface and forced it to override every outgoing frequency restriction. The screen blinked once, then displayed a grid of repeating noise. Static filled the room. I adjusted the gain. More static. Then, for one fragile second, the line cleared. A narrow spike. Green light. Signal sent. It was brief, less than a second, but it was real. I waited. I stared at the screen, counting heartbeats, watching the green light flicker. I expected silence, or more static, or nothing at all. What I got was worse. The speakers cracked, a burst of distortion, then a voice. Familiar, too familiar. My own voice. Not live, not echoed, pre-recorded. I just got here. That was it, one line, and I hadn't said those words aloud. Not until that moment, not ever in that order, not with that phrasing. But the voice was mine, same cadence, same hesitation, the exact tremor I remembered feeling on my first day when I read the list and laughed at Rule 4. The line repeated again. I just got here. I leaned forward and turned the volume down, but the signal kept playing. The same clip, on loop, perfectly preserved. No corruption, no digital warping. It sounded like I had said it just seconds ago. And maybe I had. Maybe I would. I opened the system log. The response signal was timestamped 5 days earlier, same time I had tried to fix the comms panel in the hallway, same hour I first noticed the flare gun had gone missing. That was the moment something had shifted. It was sending me to myself, or sending itself as me. I sat very still. The line repeated. Again. I just got here. This time I let it echo. The words carried weight now, not just memory, confession, a kind of preordained script, something I had been meant to say all along. But if I hadn't said it yet, and it had already been received, then I wasn't at the beginning of anything. I was the echo, a recording stuck in a loop.
The signal died. The green light flickered once, then off. The silence that followed was thicker than before, like the outpost itself had been holding its breath. I turned to the window. The dunes had shifted again. New formations, subtle ridges, a spiral pattern etched into the sand that I hadn't seen before. Not a natural spiral, deliberate, like a symbol drawn for something above or something below. I turned back to the console and checked the backup logs. There were more files, audio clips, all time-stamped at random intervals. Some before I arrived, some from days I couldn't remember. I played one. "I think I'm part of it now," the voice said. "Mine again." Another. "There was something in the walls last night." Another. And another. "This place remembers you." I stopped the playback. The messages weren't cries for help. They were warnings. Not to the outside, to me. To every version of me that would come here, stand here, wire the antenna, and think there was still a way out. The desert did not trap you in space. It trapped you in self. A recursive loop of fear, curiosity, violation, punishment. Learn the rules, break them, return, forget, repeat. And the transmissions were breadcrumbs, left not by survivors, but by reflections, by the voice of the outpost wearing my throat. I unplugged the cables, shut the console down. There was no one left to hear me. The real message had already been sent, and the person who had sent it was not me anymore. Maybe he never had been. The rule sheet had 7 lines. 7 clean, printed, bullet-pointed rules laminated in plastic and handed to me like an afterthought. I had memorized them. I had broken most. I had watched them fail to protect me. But they were all I had. For days, I kept returning to them like scripture, searching between the lines, wondering what I had missed, wondering what the original author had already known and never dared to say aloud. By now, the paper was worn at the corners. The lamination had begun to bubble. Heat or time, maybe both, had made the ink start to bleed just slightly along the edges of each word. That morning, I stood in front of the pantry, not out of hunger, out of instinct. The food had long since become irrelevant. Cans lined the shelf. Packaged meals sat untouched. But behind the rations, I had always sensed something, an itch, a pull, as if the metal walls were hiding more than wiring and storage. I pulled everything out, one by one, carefully, slowly. The shelves groaned under my hands. Then I saw it, a shallow gouge in the metal panel behind the lowest shelf. At first it looked like a gent, but then the light caught it right, and I saw lines, hand-carved. I knelt down and wiped away the dust. Scratched into the wall, barely visible, were words. "You are not the first." The letters were uneven, cut into the metal with something sharp and desperate. Beneath the sentence, there were tally marks, 4 rows, 10 marks each. Some shallow, some deep enough to rust. 40. And below those, a 5th row, 5 more marks. 45. I stared at them for a long time. It didn't make sense. This was a single occupancy outpost, rotational, 1 person per shift, 7 days. In, out, clean records, clean logs.
Yet 45 marks, each one carved with force, each one a confession. I took the edge of a broken fork I'd hidden under my cot and dragged a fresh line beneath the others. 46. The metal shrieked softly under pressure. I sat back and stared at the rows. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I blinked, and one mark was gone. Not smudged, not faint. Gone. Erased as if it had never been carved. 45 again. I counted. Once, then again. Still 45. I added another line. 46. I turned away, heart racing. I waited 5 seconds. Turned back. 44. I whispered under my breath, testing my own sanity. No. I scraped 2 new tallies in hard, deep strokes. 46. Looked away. Waited. Turned back. 43. My stomach twisted. The room swayed slightly. It wasn't time erasing them. It was memory. The wall was keeping track, but not of how many had been here. It was counting how many still remained, how many were still real, and the numbers were going down. I backed away, hand still holding the fork like a weapon. The outpost groaned overhead. The walls felt thinner. The air tasted differently, sharper, metallic, like rain on old copper pipes. I suddenly understood the most important thing I'd learned since arriving. The outpost did not house people. It processed them. Shift after shift, loop after loop, one by one they came through, learned the rules, broke the rules, and were erased, cut out of reality like infected cells. The only trace they left behind was scratched metal and whispered warnings. And even those didn't stay. I sat in the center of the room and stared at the walls. Every dent, every bolt, every vibration. Had someone screamed here? Had they begged? Had they prayed?
Had they thought they could escape? One by one, they were erased. But something inside me whispered that maybe they were not truly gone, just altered, absorbed, rewritten, made part of whatever network this place fed. I went back to the wall with shaking hands. This time I didn't scratch a line. I wrote a word, remember. Then I backed away and stared at it, afraid to blink. The letters stayed for 1 breath, 2. Then, as I exhaled, they shimmered, not disappeared, shimmered, like heat on the surface of the sand. And the word changed. Stay. I stumbled back and fell against the doorframe. The metal beneath my fingertips pulsed once, not with electricity, with breath. I could feel the outpost inhaling, alive. It had been alive the whole time. I looked down at my hands. Grains of sand clung to my palms. When I wiped them on my shirt, they didn't fall. They stayed, fused to my skin. The walls hissed quietly around me. Another tally disappeared. I didn't know who it had belonged to. Maybe me, maybe not yet. But the 8th rule was clear now. It was not a rule meant for prevention. It was the rule that revealed the truth behind all the others. You are not the first, and soon you will not even be the last. There's no clock anymore. I stopped checking days ago, or what felt like days. Time here does not keep pace with thought. It folds, swirls, collapses. The sun hasn't moved in what should be hours, maybe longer. The light outside is fixed in a permanent late afternoon hue, casting long shadows that do not shift, no matter how long I watch them. But I no longer need a clock to know what's happening. I can feel it now, in my skin. The change began slowly, like a rash, a dry patch along my wrist that never smoothed, never peeled. When I touched it, it felt like dust, fine and soft, but it didn't come off. It clung, it burrowed. Eventually, it spread. Now I feel the grains under my skin, moving. Not constantly, not painfully, just rearranging. They drift beneath the surface like sediment underwater, following the current of my pulse. I press my palm flat against the table and watch tiny specks of sand push outward through the pores, then sink back in, as if sensing my attention. I do not panic. Not anymore. Panic is for those who still believe there is a line between what they are and what they are becoming. My fingernails are translucent now. My veins are pale gray. I do not remember when I last blinked. My eyes feel dry, but it no longer bothers me.
I think the sand has filled those spaces too. Keeps the eyes open. Keeps them still. Stillness matters here. I remember that. Stillness was in the rules, or beneath them. The rules were never commands. They were descriptions, observations of what the desert does, not what we can resist. I don't remember my name. That was one of the last things to go. It slipped out of reach during a sleepless night. I tried to write it down, just to tether myself, but the pen shook in my hand. The letters collapsed into slashes, then into circles, then into something that looked like the symbols in the tunnel walls. Now, when I try to recall who I was, I feel a hollow space in my mind, a silence that wasn't there before. And inside that silence is the sound of sand whispering in my own voice. Sometimes it tells me things, not in words, in direction. I no longer eat. The food has no taste. My body no longer asks for it. I drink, but only when the sand in my throat begins to grind. Sleep happens in strange flashes now, not real rest. Just moments where I stop existing, then return. Each time, something is different. The wall looks newer. The door looks older. The hallway has changed direction. The crack in the east wing floor is gone. Or maybe I'm just in a different version of the outpost now. There are many. I've seen them. Sometimes at night, I look out and spot another outpost in the dunes. Same building, same shape, but slightly wrong. The door swings the opposite direction. The lights flicker in a pattern I do not recognize. A shape stands in the window, not moving. Sometimes I wave to it. Sometimes it waves back. I no longer know which one is real. Maybe none of them are. I sit at the window often now. I don't lock the door anymore. There's no point. What lives out there no longer waits for permission. It comes when it wants. It watches when it wants. But it does not harm, not directly. It changes. That's what it does. It remakes. And I am nearly finished. This morning, or what I think was morning, I looked down at the floor and saw boot prints. Not mine. Fresh. Deep. Coming from the main entrance, dragging a bit on the right side. Someone limping slightly. Someone new. I stared at the prints for a long time. They crossed the room, paused near the desk, then led into the sleeping quarters. I listened. There was no sound. But the dust in the air shifted. The walls felt warm, like they always do just before someone speaks. I walked to the pantry. The scratched tally marks were gone. In their place, a single symbol. Circular, inward spiraling, like the one I saw at the end of the fossil tunnel. I traced it with my finger. The metal was hot to the touch. Back at the window, the sand shifted again. A ripple moved across the closest dune, steady and wide, like something just beneath the surface had changed direction. New prints appeared, coming from the east, not walking, forming, pressed into the sand by invisible feet. One step, then another, then a second trail beside it. 2 sets now, approaching. I know what it means. Someone is coming. Maybe 2, maybe more. The outpost will show them the rules. It always does. 7 lines, 8 if they find the wall behind the pantry. They'll read them, laugh at them, break them. Then the desert will begin. The whispering will start. The tunnel will open. The copies will wave. The loop will reset. And somewhere along the way, they'll see a figure at the window. Someone watching from inside. Still, silent, almost human. I feel no need to warn them. There is no warning anymore. only invitation. The desert remembers what you forget. It has remembered me, and soon it will remember them.